Welcome.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Learning from Smart People. I am your host, Rob Oliver, and my smart person today is Anastasia Lipske. She is the founder of Access Speakers, which is a full-service speaker and podcast guest booking agency. She's secured over 1,500 speaking engagements for her clients, and she joins me today to talk about podcast guesting. Anastasia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rob. It's such a pleasure. I am thrilled to be able to chat with you after hearing you on Katarina's podcast and then listening to your podcast and being able to hear some of your guests. And I've really enjoyed the things that you've been sharing here. So glad to be a part of it.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. So let's talk about this. Let's start with what's your backstory? Kind of how did you get to where you are today?
Well, I personally think it's a God thing because when I think back to these crazy paths that he sent me down, I don't think I could have thought this up because what I do is very unique. The podcast booking agency part, we have a very unique model. The idea of a podcast booking agency is not new. The idea of a free speaker agency, which is what we focus on, is very unusual. People pay us to book them to speak for free, but they know that it's one of the best marketing tools that's out there. So I actually started in tourism. That's what I did for more than 30 years of my life, specializing in international tourism, especially, and, luxury tourism. And I did a lot of event planning and had a lot of experience with that, which then led me into an opportunity to ultimately be part of a social media conference and help them vet speakers. So I was on the other end of it. This was during, 2008. Remember that year? That was not a good year. I actually walked away from a very, very good contract because I'd never been unemployed and thought, no problem, I could be hired. And tourism was hit hard. So I went through a 2-year period of not having sustainable work and threw myself into social media. So I therefore got into that social media conference because of my interest in it and my experience with event planning. I also did some side work, if you will, at a sustainable farm. Again, through a social media connection at TweetUp back in the early days of Twitter when people didn't know what we were up to. And that person ultimately came to me and said, hey, my business coach has told me that I should be speaking to grow my business. I don't know where to begin. You've got connections. At that point, I was still unemployed. So I had done a little bit of work for the conference, a little bit of work for this farm. And she said, I'll pay you. I'll just, you line them up. I'll pay you to find me gigs. I'd never done it. I had no idea what I was doing, but I'll do anything once, twice if I like it. So I thought, okay. And I just started reaching out to Rotary clubs because I knew that they needed people, and then started reaching out to networking groups. And when people would connect with me, they'd be like, wait, do you have more speakers like this? Because first off, she was amazing. And not many people represent people who speak for free. It's just not the norm in the industry. It breaks the traditional model of a speaker agency that takes 20 to 30% of that speaker fee or honorarium they get on behalf of their clients. So I found I was good at it. My client, it was her number one marketing tool. It was how she got more people to come to her farm. All she did was talk about sustainable agriculture and then invite them to the farm to go on a tour. And when they get out to their farm, they'd see how amazing it was, see her operation. And then they would sign up for her weekly CSA so that they were getting a box of meats and vegetables every week from her farm. Or maybe they spent money at the farm store that day, but it was a really effective tool. So she was like, everybody's got to do this. Every business has got to do it. Started telling all our BNI people, and little by little, people found out about me. I, to this day, have not marketed my business per se. Every single client has come to me through a referral, with the exception of one client who's one of my oldest clients that found a very old tweet. I'm not even on Twitter anymore. I'm like so over that's so, it's not exciting for me anymore. Everybody else, no, it's just been through referrals. So when you stumble upon something that works and you're good at it, and there's a need for it, it just naturally grows. So
Okay.
that's kind of how it happened.
Right. So help me out. You used a couple of acronyms in there. CSA, I'm
Sorry.
assuming is a crop sharing agreement. Is that
Yes, yes, yes,
okay?
yes.
And you also mentioned BNI, which is
That is a networking group, Business Networking International? I'm not
okay.
sure. It's a networking group that's, I guess international.
Sure.
So a lot of
Okay.
people go in there and they have weekly meetings and connect with each other that way. So, my apologies.
Oh,
I know better than to use acronyms, but I did.
nope. No problem. But we swim in the ocean of alphabet soup, and it's all
Yeah.
good. I just like to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I
Yes.
just want to key on something you said. People are paying you to get them booked to speak for free.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit, like, um, it's so counterintuitive because to be a speaker, you want to go out and you want to, Tony Robbins is making buku bazillion bucks every year because he's getting paid massive amounts of money per speech,
Right.
and you're saying, no, let's get you booked to speak for free, but there's obviously going to have to be some value in there that you're
Right.
selling your clients on. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So the people that I represent are what we refer to as platform marketing speakers. They are people who speak for free to grow their business. Let's say you're a chiropractor and you go out to local groups and you educate them about spine care, how to take care of themselves. You're not pitching yourself. You're just educating them about the importance of hydration, the research to prove why that helps with your spine, blah blah blah. You're just going out there sharing your passion, your expertise, and if you do that well, if you do it to bless the audience, what will happen is that there's going to be a certain percentage of people that are going to resonate with that. And they're going to think, you know what? I've been having this crick in my neck for years. Maybe I need to go to them. Or my brother-in-law is complaining about his back pain. And then they're going to then come to them as clients. So there's that. And it really doesn't matter what your business is. If you can get out there and educate people about it, it's going to help you get seen. There's this the Google juice factor, the SEO factor, search engine optimization, so that people can be found online, is really powerful. And there is this idea, this concept of law of familiarity. So the more often your name is seen out there, the more people are going to have this automatic sense of trust that comes with that. But more than anything, when you are communicating with them, it's almost like sample advertising, which we know is one of the most effective forms of advertising that's out there, because people get a taste for who you are and what you're about. And it's an energy thing too. There may be sometimes that someone's just not going to relate to you, but it may be because you remind them of somebody that they don't like. Who knows? So if a person does this well, then they can use that to generate influence, awareness, and clients. It's kind of my tagline in the ebook that I wrote. So there's that aspect of it. Having said that, there is also the professionally paid speakers who are the ones that are doing this as a business. So it's not using speaking as a marketing tool, but speaking is their business. But unless you're a celebrity, you don't just decide one day, I'm going to be a speaker and somebody's going to pay you 10 grand to talk. You got to pay your dues on the free circuit first. And you also need to not only build visibility, but you also have to have that experience. You might know something like the back of your hand, but until you have shared it multiple times and really tweaked how you can present that, you're not going to be as effective and you're not going to be able to command those types of fees. So I do have what I refer to, at least, as emerging speakers. And those are the people that are in that process. So they'll still pay us to book them to speak for free, but they're pulling it out of that marketing budget because they know that they need to do this in order to get where they want to go. Malcolm Gladwell talks about the 10,000 hours towards mastery. And we know that the more often a person is out there sharing their message, the better they're going to get. and the more they're going to be seen. So there's that as well. But yeah, it is a very unique model. And I love it because I feel like I'm making a difference in the world. I believe in the messages of all of the clients that we represent, and I can help them get those messages out to more people.
Sure. And one of your clients, I think, is Jill Lublin, who I
Yeah.
had her on, and her paraphrase of your idea is, it's the I think I heard of you somewhere before concept,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So that
Yes.
it's
Yes.
what you were talking about with the familiarity. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the speaking side of things, but what I really wanted to bring you on today to talk about is um, the podcast guesting
Hmm.
as a way to build your brand and as a marketing tool. So let's talk about that a little bit, because these days, you know, if podcasts are becoming ubiquitous. There seems to be a bunch of them, and everyone says, well, if you're going to do something, well, go ahead and start a podcast. But you're saying, let's not start with the why start a podcast, but let's go with the other direction, and you're guesting on other people's podcasts. Can you talk about how, like, what opens your awareness to this, and kind of how does that whole concept work?
Well, that would be called COVID. So I did, for years, I have had some of my clients ask me if we could book them on podcasts, and I did not have the bandwidth at all. And then March of 2020 came along, and that was a very bad month because every single email I got was a cancellation. I basically lost my business overnight.
Mm.
The only other person I know that had a free speaker agency with a similar, yet we were different, a similar business model, and she and I, we had communicated with each other, so not competition. She shut down. She shut down in COVID. So
Wow.
there I was, in shock, like so many people, and I had to embrace the pivot word of 2020 and thought podcasts. Podcasts always have been virtual, and they always will be virtual. No matter what goes on in this world, people can podcast. And the idea of being able to come up with something for all my grounded speakers, because now they've got nowhere to talk. So I started doing that. Now, in the very beginning, especially, not every group was on the virtual bandwagon. Now, so much time went by that a lot of groups have gone virtual. Some of them are hybrid. Some of them are going back to in person. Like, it's just kind of all over the place. But the podcast guesting, that's still happening. So I just used the same technique and process that we use for our unique speaker agency and applied that towards podcast bookings. I feel like we do it differently. Most of the other podcast agencies, I feel they charge like a package rate or a monthly rate, and I believe they guarantee you X amount of bookings. We do it differently. We just charge on production. If we get you booked, you pay, and it's only for something that you actually want to be booked on. We always
Mm.
run it by you first. So that's kind of where it started. And what I found is that it's a great way, again, for visibility. When speakers were grounded, the ones that were out there on the podcast, those are the ones that are going to come up at the top of search engines now that the world is opening up again and we're having meetings again. So there's that, as well as just the visibility as a whole. Now, I think being a podcast host and having your own show is awesome as well. And so podcast hosts often will want to be guests as well, because it's one of the best ways for you to continue to get visibility. And sometimes there's reciprocity. You can't always have reciprocity because it really depends on the subject matter. No one wants to be interviewed or interview someone that's not really a good fit for their audience. You always have to be paying attention to the end listener, not whether it's a good fit for the two of you to swap. So like you and Katarina Rando, perfect swap because of what you both speak on and your audiences. So that makes total sense. So it's not just people who don't want to do a podcast host. Some of my clients are podcast hosts themselves, and they do podcast guesting. But it's a great way to get your message out. And I personally will take podcast guesting over speaking any day. I would just rather have a conversation than to do an actual presentation. But I know that for many people, the speaking is where it's at. And I get that. And I support that, and obviously, because that's what I do for a living, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are a couple things that go with podcasting that make it, to me, that make it advantageous. The first of which is that when you do a presentation, most of the time it is available only for the people that are in the room at that point
Mhm.
in time.
Right.
Whereas with a podcast, it the location spans the globe. You can be heard by people around the world. And additionally, the podcast episodes live on in perpetuity. So after the episode is recorded, somebody can hear that again later on down the line. And what you're doing is you're both broadening the scope of who can hear it, and you're broadening the length of time as to when that message can be heard. And I think that definitely is advantageous. And
Absolutely.
let's talk about this. Do you have tips for people on how to be good podcast guests, um, as opposed to, listen, I've been doing this now. It's funny you say COVID, right? And my learning from smart people started, guess when? April of 2020, right? Because
Yeah.
I wanted to do a podcast. I didn't have time. All of a sudden, like you said, in March, my calendar opened wide up, and all of a sudden, I've got time to do what I wanted to, but didn't have before. Um, I get all kinds of pitches from people who are not actually suited for my show, and I get a pitch that's all about them, or I interview someone, and it's basically a 30-minute infomercial for
Mm.
what they do, or it's 30 minutes in which they talk about themselves, and there's really no value given to the audience. Can you talk a little bit about, suggestions for people on how to make sure that you are finding the right podcast, and then once you have found that podcast, how to make sure that you're adding value?
Yes. And I like to think of this as etiquette. I often use the word best practices because that seems to fall better on people's ears sometimes. But I am a 60-year-old grandmother, so I do come back to etiquette and how you treat people. And keeping in mind that you always want to be from the viewpoint of what if I'm the host? What would I want if I were the host? And what would I want if I was the listener? You have to remember that the ultimate goal of any podcast host is to get as many listeners, subscribers, downloads, ratings, reviews. So anything that you as a potential guest can do to support them in that, that's what you want to focus on. And number one starts with making certain that your message is in alignment with theirs. Because if it's not, you're not serving anybody. That's not good for you and your branding. It's not good for the host. And you might waste your time because the host may just choose not to air it. Or if they do, it's not going to be one of their best episodes. So, first off, make certain that you really are a good fit. And that means listening to the show. At least listen for maybe 10 minutes of a couple of shows. But I'll tell you what, if you listen until for at least for one full show, then I'm hoping you ask the same three questions. A lot of times hosts will have questions at the end, and you're not going to know that as a podcast guest. And it's kind of nice to prepare yourself. Like, I'm really hoping you're going to ask me the same three questions that you asked Angie. Oh no. Okay. Well, nonetheless, I did my homework. All right, y'all. So just if you are podcast guesting, always listen to the end because some people will have questions and sometimes it's the same question. So you can be prepared, but you want to make sure you're a good fit. I can't tell you how many people have reached out and offered themselves on shows that don't even have guests. Hello.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to find this out. And I will tell you, of all the platforms that are out there, the one I like to look at the most for the quickest summation is Apple Podcasts. Because if you go to Apple Podcasts and you look at that show, you have a description of that show right then and there. It tells you what they are into. You can see when their last show was. If it was, 9 months ago, you might not want to reach out to them. Or if they only their shows are so so like not consistent. I'm losing
Right.
my train of thought. Erratic.
Right.
And you look at them, it's like, not really feeling it. You got to pay attention. So you want to look at the description, you want to look at how many shows they've done, when their last show was, are they consistent, what their ratings and reviews are, because that's going to be important to you as well. Read some of the reviews and listen to some of the shows. Ideally, you would actually do a review yourself, rate and review the show yourself. And then when you are, I like to call it proposing. There's something about me and the word pitch just doesn't feel right to me. So we propose our clients to hosts. And when we do, we always want to make sure that we've got something that's rather personalized in there. So if you are proposing yourself to a show, when you do go to that show, you say, I really feel I'm a perfect fit for your show because on episode 239, when Sally Smith spoke about XYZ, I speak on something similar, but from a very different angle that I really feel would benefit your audience listeners. Something along those lines that tells that host right off the bat that first, you care enough to even listen. And secondly, that you're kind of reaffirming that you are a good fit. Now, ultimately, the host may still not feel it, and that's okay. We can't have attachment. When someone either doesn't respond or they come back and say no, you just shake the dust off your sandals and you move on. But you're going to greatly increase your chances if you personalize it. Then when you do the show, make sure that excuse me, I'm going to say one thing else. When this show comes back to you and they ask you for content, please get it to them. If they ask you for your bio, they ask you for your headshot, they ask you to answer some questions, don't sit on it for 2 weeks. These people are busy. You're busy, right? So, and some hosts have very specific things that they want in advance. So people need to make sure that they're very responsive. Or maybe they come back and say, here, great, love to have you. Here's my calendar link. And then someone doesn't respond to it for 2 weeks. Crazy. So there's that. Oh my gosh, I could go on forever. Let me just stop and just leave it with that right now, because I know that we have a limit amount of time, but I can also talk about things to do after the show if you would like.
So I think that's wonderful. Let's go back to you said proposal.
Yeah.
I think that you're spot on with this. When I get someone who pitches me or sends me a proposal or whatever you want to call it, and they specifically mention an episode, they specifically mention something that they heard on the show, that puts them at the top of my list. Okay. As opposed, there are people who send me stuff and it's the same proposal that they sent to every other podcast that's out there. And their hope is that, if I send to enough, one of them's going to have me on. It's actually less about making sure that I get on the right podcast and more about just making sure that I get on a podcast. And
right.
To me, it does a disservice both to the individual in their expertise, and it does a disservice to the host and to the listeners as well. Because if you're not bringing the right stuff, then you're not enriching those folks. So talk to me about two things. Number one, when you're working with people on those proposals, on the pitch, I know that you use a one sheet. Can you talk about that one sheet, how to prepare that one sheet, are there some mistakes to avoid, something like that, so that people can kind of have some guidelines moving forward?
Absolutely. So one sheets, for clarification, in the speaking world, can be referred to as a one sheet, a speaker sheet, and it's basically a media sheet that gives the meeting planner or the podcast host the opportunity to have a summation of what you're all about. If you're going to do a one sheet, and I do recommend it, make it professional, because if it's a crappy one sheet, it will actually damage your brand more than if you don't have one at all. So that's number one. And I'm not saying that you have to hire a professional. You can go to Canva. There are one sheet templates that you can get. And also, one sheets can be more than one sheet. So depending upon how prolific a speaker is or a podcast guest is, sometimes it'll be 2 pages, but we still refer to it as a one sheet. There are the speaker one sheets and there are the podcast guesting one sheets. You can also do kind of a combo. Mine is like a combo. I really prefer, as I shared, I prefer to be an interviewee on a guest on a show. So it's geared a little bit more towards that than my speaking, but I do speak. When people invite me to speak, I rarely ever say no. So you can do one of each or a combo. But the main difference is in what you're sharing on that one sheet as to whether you're talking about you as a podcast guest or you as a speaker. The biggest mistakes that people make on these one sheets is, number one, they forget their contact information. No joke. Like, I saw a one sheet that came from a marketing company and there was no contact information on it. And they said, well, we attach it to the email. I'm like, that gets separated. It gets separated. Anyway, so their contact information, number one, making certain that you are basically promoting yourself as a speaker and or podcast guest. You're not promoting your business. So a lot of people tend to talk about what they do for their clients. They have testimonials about how great so-and-so is. They helped my business with this, or they helped with that, blah, blah, blah. That's not important. You're going to get business because you're speaking or you're podcast guesting, but you need to convince that person that's on the other end that's considering you that you're a great podcast guest or a great speaker. So keep the focus on getting you booked to speak or booked to podcast guest, not get you business. That's not what a one sheet is for. It is important to have testimonials. It is very important to have an idea, like a list of where you have spoken before or what podcast shows you've been on, just so that they see that you've done that. Now, I'm going to say that if you're just starting out and you don't have that list, that's okay too. But one of the beautiful things is that now that everything is digital, the one sheets are all digital. So they are not, used to be, you'd have to print out your speaker one sheets by the thousands, and then you find a typo, or you just got a really great gig that you really want to be on that podcast or that one sheet. And now it's too late because you want to use all 1,000 of them, right? No, you can change it up. Every time you get booked for another show, you add that to your list. And then what's going to happen is eventually, when you're on so many podcasts, you be selective about which ones you list on there, and make certain that what you're listing are the shows that either have notoriety or they are most in alignment. They are most in your lane of the types of shows you want to be booked on. So those are some of the key things. I mean, there's a lot more that can be said about it, but I would say that those are the primary things. The other thing I do see, one last thing that I see people making mistakes on, is a lot of times they're really highlighting the person's name at the top. And the name is kind of secondary. The highlight really needs to be on what you are about. What is your primary message? You want to kind of hit them with that being the primary thing that's going to catch their eye. So.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. We are almost out of time. We're actually out of time, but I'm going to make an exception for you. Okay. And that is, talk about what are like one or two things that are your tips for once you have been a podcast guest. How do you maximize the value of that podcast appearance?
Okay. So first off, may I take a screenshot of the two of us?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I am going to be sharing socially this screenshot and saying, awesome podcast with Rob Oliver. I'll let you know when I know this is live, but you know, a lot of times they're not. So, you know, I'll share the link when it's out, etc. So enjoyed my time with him. Absolutely loved it. Check out his show. I've listened to it. Really liked Angie, by the way, Angie, because she's about podcasting.
Right.
And then you tag the show host. Okay. And make sure that you're getting them the visibility, because that's what it's about, right? Personally, I like to also send a thank you note. Now, I know this is the old grandmother etiquette that comes in, but I tell you, that goes a long way, because guess what, Rob, you know people, you know other podcasters. I want you to be my new best friend, because I want you in your circles with other podcasters to be saying, you know what, this Anastasia, she's awesome. Y'all got to have her on your podcast, because that's one of the best ways to do that. And I will ask you, do you know of any podcast shows that might be interested in my message? I will also be sending you a request for a testimonial about me as a guest. I also will do a testimonial about the podcast host on LinkedIn. I do all this on LinkedIn, because then it's permanently attached to you. Because wouldn't you want more testimonials about you as a podcast host on your LinkedIn profile? So those are just some of the many things that you can do to get visibility for that podcast host. It's just sharing the love and treating people like you want to be treated. If I was a host, what would make me happy? What would I love for that guest to do after the show?
Excellent. I think that's great advice. Listen, if people want to get in touch with you, they want to learn more about what you do and learn more about your organization, what's the best way to do that?
I have a simple thank you page. If you just go to accessspeakers.biz/thank you, in there, it will give you a link to you signing up and getting my ebook if you want my book on using speaking. Also, it applies to podcast guesting, okay? But speaking to grow your business, to generate influence, awareness, and clients, you can get that free ebook. And it also has information about my monthly Q&A. It's a free virtual Q&A to pick the brain of a speaker and podcast booking agent. And that's it. And I also recommend anyone who's doing podcast guesting have a page specifically for this purpose. Make it super simple. Just hide it or don't publish it on your site so that it's specific to anyone who's coming to it. And then you can put whatever content you want in there. And you can check mine out as an example.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Listen, it is time for 3 questions to establish your humanity. Are you ready for these, my friend?
Yes.
No problem. What was your first job?
Oh, first job was working for Western Motors in Petaluma during high school as an admin person. And it was actually a lot of fun to work with all these. Well, they seemed very old salesmen to me, but now I think I'm their age. So that's where I started. Absolutely. Administrative work. Yeah.
Okay. What is one thing that you will never do again?
I will never balance a huge pot of boiling turkey stock leaning against my body with the refrigerator door open, trying to make space for it.
Excellent. The last question for you is, what is your favorite comfort food of all time? If you're ever having one of those days where you're just stressed out and you think, you know what, if I could just have this, it just makes me feel good.
Well, I would have to say, Talenti pistachio gelato, but the one thing that I turn to the most, and honestly, I eat it maybe 80% of my days, I make my own popcorn. I use sprouted popcorn. I cook it with duck fat, coconut oil, olive oil. I use grass-fed butter on the top. I sprinkle it with nutritional yeast, turmeric, and seaweed, which I know people are probably going to think it's crazy, but let me tell you, it is so good. Oh, delicious. And I generally will eat it in the bathtub while listening to an audiobook.
Okay. All information that may have been a little bit more than I was asking for, but it's all good as long as you are happy and you're enjoying it.
And I will say, happy. It fills my soul.
I will say you're in very good company, but my mother is a popcorn addict and just spends all of her days trying to figure out what time she should put the popcorn in the microwave. So listen, Anastasia Lipske, thank you so much for being here. You are indeed a smart person. For all my listeners, thank you for joining us today. This has been a trial run I've got a podcast interview marathon coming up on May 6th and 7th for the Perspectives on Healthcare podcast that I do. Keep your ears and eyes peeled for more information about that. And in the meantime, I will remind you that when you stop learning, you stop living. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.